reading, and the extension of messages which are kind of egalitarian. And this notion of democratizing religious knowledge, I think, can be broken into three different categories, and these are my own categories and my own way of thinking about this. So we can think of the way that print democratized reading and publishing and the production of literature, literary culture, perhaps we could say, in three different ways, at least three different ways. So one of these is through the proliferation of popular literature. So here, and the time period I have in mind here are the 1850s and 1860s, where a number of different genres were, a lot of literature is being sold in places like bazaars, and these included folklore, dramas, mythologies, kind of popular retellings of Hindu myths, Shaiva myths, satires, which would often make fun of higher class or caste people, make fun of the wealthy. Almanacs, also very widely read and distributed. So this sort of democratization involves the extension of these usually quite cheap reading materials to a wide range of people. And what you get with print, both in India and in Europe as well, is not only a difference in the production of literature, but the reception changes as well. Generally, it's accompanied with greater literacy. And so this happened in India as well. You had the expansion of reading publics. You had wider literacy happening with higher rates of publication. So the first type of democratization is this popular reading. In addition to these popular publications, you had a lot of publications of canonical literature. So here, in terms of Shaivism, I'm thinking of things like Devanam, Ganyaparanam, Manikavasahara's works, Tirukovayar, Tiruvasaham, these sorts of works. Also, you had the Vedas in the Sanskrit publishing world as well. And so this extended these texts to new audiences and made them freely available in the public sphere. Though generally, as we'll see, these were very expensive books, and so they wouldn't be sold generally in bazaars. They had a much more kind of elite readership. But that said, it was still a wider readership than they would have enjoyed when they were in manuscript form and much more expensive to produce. The third category, and this is where Tiruvarutpa fits in, are works which directly challenge, I think, orthodoxy and established institutions. And this is what we know of Tiruvarutpa, really the radically anti-caste character of those verses. What's interesting is the 1867 edition. This is the first part of Tiruvarutpa, not the whole thing. It was the first part. It was about half of what we know today as Tiruvarutpa, published in 1867. Didn't contain any of the really radical verses. And Ramalinga himself said he only wanted verses that he had composed to Shiva himself directly, published in this first volume. So none of the radical verses were there. So why was Navalar and the established institutions, why were they so opposed to the publication when it didn't have actually a radically challenging message? This is part of what I want to think about today. What was the challenge of this first edition? So I'm going to go through each of these just very quickly to show you the different categories, because I want to set up a few distinctions that then I'll explain later on. So what I'm drawing from here is a catalog of publications in Tamil that John Murdoch, the Irish missionary, wrote with the help of a couple of pundits who I think did probably much more work than they were given credit for, I'm sure. And they produced this catalog of Tamil printed books, which in 1865. So basically all the books that they could get their hands on, they included in this catalog. So it's a very good, it gives us a very good sense of the published landscape at that time. I'm sure the Rojamutaya Library has many of these. Probably one of the best ways you could do one of these catalogs today is by looking at the resources in this library here. So what we find in this catalog are many popular works. So these kinds of cheap publications that circulated in pamphlet forms and were very readily accessible. So I've just chosen a couple of these. Muvar Amanai, it's an anonymous work, just 24 pages long, 18 MO. This is a, they would use large sheets of paper and then fold them a number of times. So this would be quite a small publication, a pamphlet basically, for 1 anna. And these are verses of praise of Shiva and Vishnu, sung by beggars. That's Murdoch's comment. So this would be something that would be widely available and within the reach of many people in terms of purchasing it. Another one, Bhagavatam, Murdoch's comment, a very popular work in which the wives of Vishnu and Shiva rake up stories against each other's husband. Sounds like quite an interesting piece of work. Just 7 pages long, again a small pamphlet size, anonymous, and it cost 3 pi, which was just 1/64th of a rupee. It's very cheap, actually very cheap. So this is popular literature, and these would be sold in bazaars around Chennai, but also I think in many of the towns around Tamil Nadu had books, these sorts of books for sale. The second category is canonical works. These are things like, as I said before, the Pedya Puranam. This was published in 2 volumes. Unfortunately, Murdoch doesn't give the editor's name nor the publishing dates, nor the publishers themselves, so we don't have that information. This was half of the entire epic, published with a commentary, 802 pages, 3 1/4 rupees, quite expensive, very expensive, and just about 200 times the price of that last work that we just saw. So these books probably would not circulate freely at the bazaars. They were out of the purchasing power of most people. So only the people who were wealthy or keen to get a hold of these works would buy them. Devaram, just about the whole Devaram was available by this time, by 1865, in print. 3 volumes of Sambandhar's verses were available for 4 rupees, again very expensive. 1 volume of Sundarar's verses listed for 1 1/4 rupees, and Uppar's verses were currently in print, currently in press when this was published in 1865. Also, in addition to those canonical works, there were also kind of tools to help people access those works. So here's where I think we get the democratization of print again. The publication of works that help one come to grips with reading these very difficult canonical works, poetic works. So one of these, which Murdoch, this is the very well-known Pedya Purana Vasanam by Adamukha Navalar. This was published in 1851. And in Navalar's preface to this, he actually says he's published this to make this work available widely to the Shaiva people. Also, he urges people to read his Periya Purana Vasanam out loud to people who couldn't read, who were non-literate people. So these were meant to kind of bring the text to the people. So this is a sort of democratizing effect of print. Also, there were collections of verses. So the Devaram, the original Devaram, the full Devaram was about 6 rupees, 7 rupees or so. You could get a compilation of verses in a work called Devara Paliham, which was only 6 pi, which was very cheap. So in this way, they tried to bring, there were attempts to bring these classical works within the purchasing power of the general public. Ramalinga himself got involved very early, and interestingly enough, the very same year that Navalar published his first book, I'm pretty sure that's right, it was his first publication, the Periya Purana Vasanam. Ramalinga himself published his first work, and this was, he edited a commentary on the Shaiva philosophical work. So those are the first 2 categories. Now I want to think a little bit about this third category, because this is where the Tiruvarutpa fits in. However, there were other printed works that did not fit into either of these categories. That is, literature that was produced by educated religious leaders who worked outside the centers of religious authority. I don't have kind of data on it, but many of these canonical works were being funded partly at least by the mutts, and also the scholars, the pundits who were bringing these out were often associated with mutts. So there's other literature coming out which is not connected to these kind of centered, established institutional centers of Shaivism. These publications directly challenged established Hindu views and institutions, either by propounding an innovative and provocative message, or, as in the case of Tiruvarutpa, by laying claim to a religious authority equal to that of established texts and institutions. This vast literature, so for example, the vast literature of religious reform, publications by people like Ramahan Roy or Dayananda Saraswati directly attacked Hindu orthodoxy for certain Hindu practices, etc., such as animal sacrifice, sati, etc. Ramalinga's early work did not directly challenge institutions in that way. So the publication of Tiruvarutpa, a work that aspired to canonicity by a group on the margins of Shaiva institutional power, posed a challenge to South Indian Shaiva monasteries that led to polemics over the authority of texts and their leaders. That the printing of Ramalinga's work impelled such strong attacks by Navalar and others suggests that printing itself carried authority that was new in religious traditions. So the act of printing itself carried a certain authority regardless of the message carried by those publications. So here I'm drawing on a couple of people who have written about publishing in India. Stuart Blackburn, in 2003 publication on folklore and publication of Tamil folklore, writes, textual authenticity would not rely solely on the reputation of the pundit. After 1812, printing would also be used by pundits as an instrument to ensure authenticity. So what was happening at this time, print became important for making claims to the authority of text, where it used to be, of course, manuscripts, but now the work had to appear in print, this is part of my argument, in order to be considered to be important, canonical, authoritative, etc. Ulrike Stark wrote a great book on publishing in Urdu and Hindi in North India, and she writes, the successful publisher's choices not only responded to readership tastes and reflected processes of canonization, as well as current trends in literary activity, they also shaped these processes. So it wasn't just that they were printing canonical works, but what was printed was becoming canonical. And if a work wasn't printed, it could fall into obscurity. Another Venkatachalapati talks about the way that print was used to remake the Tamil literary canon in the 1880s, and here he's thinking about the work of people like Damodaram Pillai and Saminalaya, and how they used print to actually recreate a literary canon that had a secular character rather than a religious character. And what I think this points us to is that what were canonical works were themselves being debated and contested at this time, and that was certainly the case for Shaivism. So now I want to move to Tiruvarutpa itself and the publication. Ramalinga Adigal was born in 1823 in Marudur near Chidambaram. He moved to Chennai with his family when he was just a boy. He left Chennai in 1857. His earlier verses talk about Chennai with quite a bit of fondness, but his later verses start to express a certain disillusionment with the city and with urban society and culture. So he left Chennai in 1857, migrating south in his search for a quiet village life, and also to be closer to the shrinal center of Tamil Shaivism, i.e. at Chidambaram, near Chidambaram. He first went to Karambuli, and then later to Vadalur, which he often referred to as North Chidambaram. He had a traditional Tamil education, but was not educated in English, and had little apparent contact with colonial institutions or networks. And this, I think, makes him extremely interesting for a historian, because he was a local figure, a local character, and he was not educated in a colonial context. He didn't work in colonial context. And I think a lot of studies of religious figures in the 19th century are focused on these cosmopolitan figures like Ramalan Roy, often North Indian figures, Dayananda Saraswati. I think Ramalinga is very interesting for not being one of these all-India figures, but being a local figure who became very important and influential in his local community. Over his lifetime, he composed a number of prose works, as well as thousands of verses in Tamil. His students collected these verses and eventually published them in the monumental volume Tiruvarutpa, which record his reflections on God, devotion, contemporary religious practices, and Shaiva literary traditions. By 1867, Ramalinga had a devoted following in and around Vadalur, and also in Chennai. Many of his close followers were in fact still in Chennai. The publication of Tiruvarutpa was an important event in the history of this community, and began the establishment of what we might think of as a textual community, the community that formed around Ramalinga, in which Tiruvarutpa played a central role in that community, as I suggested before. Without Tiruvarutpa, where would Ramalinga be, in fact? One of his primary devotees, Irakam Iratanamuliyar, spent several years collecting Ramalinga's verses. A letter correspondence between the two describes these efforts in some detail. So they're quite interesting letters in getting some insight into the relationship between Ramalinga and his close devotee, and also in the efforts to collect Ramalinga's verses and publish them in Tiruvarutpa. The dates of the letters range from 1858 to 1869, a period in which Ramalinga was in Kadambudi for most of that time, and Mudaliar was in Chennai. In the letters, Ramalinga gives advice to the young Mudaliar on marriage and health. He thanks him for posting books and gifts. At one point, Mudaliar sends him a cloth for Ramalinga to wear. He reports on people close to him and asks about friends in Chennai. He makes financial requests and reminds Mudaliar to think often of Shiva. There are also several references to the composition of verses for eventual publication, which gives some important details of the efforts leading up to the publication of Tiruvarutpa. So in a letter dated the 7th of Thai Masam, so he always dates these using the Tamil months, and this was either 1859 or 1860. Unfortunately, the year was not marked. In a letter on this day, Ramalinga tells Iratana Mudaliar to constantly meditate on the 5 syllables of Shiva, Namah Shivaya, with a clear mind. He cites verses from Tiruvasaham and from Alvayar to support this position, but he also cites one of his own verses to support his advice. This verse, which he had written in 1860, later appears exactly the same in Tiruvarutpa in 1867. So indicating by 1860 that Ramalinga was writing down verses that were being collected and would later be published. Ramalinga wrote down verses throughout his life. Images of his handwritten verses have been reproduced in a number of editions of Tiruvarutpa. He wrote on palm leaves, on paper, and in notebooks, his life bridging the period of manuscript to palm leaf manuscript to paper and print, of course. For the most part, he wrote on palm leaves when he was in Chennai and on paper after he left Chennai in 1857. Many of his verses ended up in the possession of his followers. One long palm leaf manuscript of 202 leaves with verses of devotion to Shiva at Tiruvarutpa appears to have been kept by his student Salmaraya Mudaliar. Despite writing down his verses, Ramalinga, as is common in Tamil literary traditions, generally wrote that he sang verses, he used padaning, rather than writing them down. It seems that he saw his poems as oral compositions first, sung directly to Shiva. And indeed, his verses, he generally addresses Shiva using vocative forms, O Shiva. So he saw these, I think, primarily as oral, and writing was a kind of secondary process. In a letter written on December 30th, 1860, Ramalinga writes that he has sung many verses since arriving back in his home in Kadambudi from Chennai. He seemed to have traveled quite often between the two cities, where we can presume he had just met with Iratana Mudaliar in Chennai. He continues his letter, and this is his words. I didn't intend to write them down. He says he's written many verses. Then I didn't intend to write them down and collect them all together, so they lie scattered around. He promises to collect them and personally deliver them to Mudaliar in Chennai. So at this point, he was already being asked for verses for publication. Ramalinga expresses here a certain disregard for collecting and looking after his writings, a sentiment that he repeats in later letters. His lack of care for these written verses suggests again that he viewed these verses as oral primarily. Why did he write them down at all? Perhaps it was to share his verses with his followers, as they seem to have been dispersed among his closest students. he informs Iratnamuliyar that Kumarasamy Pillai and Sanmuham Pillai have about 50 of his poems, noting that many of these poems have already been published. He asks Iratnamuliyar to forgive the publication, the earlier publication of these poems. This reference to earlier publication of his verses is fascinating. We don't have any evidence, these don't exist today, or at least I haven't been able to find any of these. But it does indicate that there were some collections of his work in print before Tiruvarutpa. We find details of these earlier editions in a biographical work on Ramalinga that was written, published in 1924 by S.M. Kandasamy Pillai, one of his editions of Tiruvarutpa. Kandasamy Pillai notes that a few people were publishing Ramalinga's verses, but in individual pamphlets, small books, and with many printing errors. Learning of these inferior publications, some of Ramalinga's closest followers approached Ramalinga, apparently, and made known their desire to publish his verses themselves. Ramalinga didn't agree with this at first, but eventually capitulated and agreed that he would cooperate with their request for verses. The concern of his followers that these works being published contained mistakes, so that was one of their concerns, that they contained mistakes. Just as importantly, however, they worried about the publication of his verses in small, cheap pamphlets. Such pamphlets did not have a long lifespan, and they likely would have circulated at the bazaars and markets alongside other cheap publications. So they would have fallen into that first category, right, of those cheap publications. These sorts of publications were circulating widely in India at the time, and were often held in low esteem by elite authors, literary people, editors, and publishers. The British as well used to critique all of these bazaar-type publications as being filled with kind of erotic stories and things like this, salacious stories. These are precisely the sorts of works that Ramalinga's followers wanted to distinguish their publication from. His students are concerned that the ephemeral quality of these cheap publications to be read and disposed of would detract from the prestige of Ramalinga's poetry. In creating a volume that would establish the canonical nature of his words, they needed to ensure that the volume would last. Their collection of verses, when published years later, would contrast sharply from any earlier publications of verses, benefiting from the careful editing of a leading Chennai pundit, Weiss 03oct12, and published in a handsome, hefty, and expensive volume, boasting a price out of reach of most readers. So they printed it as if it was one of these canonical works. It cost 3 rupees, so it was quite expensive. By 1866, preparations for publication were in full swing. In a letter mailed from Chidambaram on March 28, 1866, Ramalinga appears to be more committed to the project. He asks Iratnamuliyar to refrain from publishing the poems in his possession because Ramalinga, since returning home, has composed about 200 poems, a huge number of poems in Malay form, in praise of Shiva at Chidambaram. So he was extremely prolific and seemed to be able to write very quickly. He also promises to send a verse